She told me like she was reading off a grocery list. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the one we'd had for 31 years, the one with the scratch near the left leg from when we moved it into the house back in 1993. She had her coffee. I had mine. And she said it the same way someone might mention needing to pick up milk. "My sister's family is coming for Easter. I'd like you to stay upstairs." I set my mug down. "I'm sorry, it's just easier," she said. "You know how my sister gets. And her husband still hasn't forgiven you for what happened at Christmas." I thought about Christmas. What happened at Christmas was that I'd told her brother-in-law that he shouldn't be driving after 3 glasses of bourbon, and he'd taken offense. That was it. That was the whole thing. "So, your solution," I said slowly, "is for me to stay upstairs in my own house. It's Easter, not a tribunal." She picked up her coffee again. "Just for a few hours. I'm not asking you to disappear forever." She almost smiled when she said it, like it was a reasonable thing, like she was being patient with a difficult child. I was 63 years old, and my wife was asking me to hide in my own bedroom so her family wouldn't have to look at me. I didn't say anything else that morning. I finished my coffee. I washed my mug. I went out to the garage, and I sat in my truck for a long time, not going anywhere, just sitting. We had been married for 34 years. I want to be clear about that because it matters. 34 years is not nothing. 34 years is a whole life built together. Our son was born in year 3. We buried my mother in year 11. We almost didn't survive year 19 when I lost my job at the plant and we had to sell the house on Birchwood and move somewhere smaller. We survived it anyway. Her family had never liked me. I understood that. I was a machinist from Central Ohio, and she had come from a family that considered themselves a notch above most people they knew. Her sister had married a man who wore blazers to backyard barbecues. Her mother had once referred to my work boots as unfortunate footwear. These were the people I had spent 3 decades tolerating at holidays and birthday dinners and graduation parties. I thought I had made peace with it, but there's a difference between being tolerated and being asked to disappear. Easter Sunday arrived the way spring days in Ohio often do. Cold in the morning, trying to warm up by afternoon, never quite getting there. I could hear them arriving downstairs. Car doors, her sister's voice, the particular laugh her brother-in-law had, loud and self-congratulatory, the laugh of a man who assumed every room was glad he'd entered it. I sat in the armchair by the bedroom window with a book I wasn't reading. At some point my wife came up. She was wearing the blue dress she saved for family occasions. She looked nice. She always looked nice when her family came. "Everything okay up here?" she asked. "Fine," I said. She nodded and went back downstairs. Around 1 in the afternoon, I could smell the ham. It had been marinating since Friday in that brown sugar and mustard glaze I had actually taught her to make from a recipe my mother had used. I could hear them all laughing down there. I could hear my brother-in-law holding court about something. I could hear dishes being passed around. I closed the book. I put on my coat and my shoes and I went downstairs, through the kitchen where the good dishes were stacked, and I walked out the side door without saying a word to anyone. I drove to the truck stop on Route 9, and I had a coffee and a piece of pie, and I sat at the counter and watched the trucks roll in and out. The waitress was maybe 30, with tired eyes and a kind way about her. She refilled my cup without being asked. I left her a 20 on a $4 check. Then I drove to my buddy Leonard's house and I sat on his porch and we watched baseball on his outdoor TV and we didn't talk much, which was exactly what I needed. My wife called at 4:17. I let it go to voicemail. "They're leaving soon," she said on the message. "You can come back." I listened to that twice. "You can come back." Like I was a dog that had wandered off. Like the house had been borrowed for the afternoon, and she was returning it to me now. I stayed at Leonard's for dinner. He made chili. It was a good evening. When I got home that night, my wife was already in bed. I slept on the couch, not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't think of a single reason to do otherwise. In the morning, she came downstairs and found me in the kitchen making eggs. "We should talk," she said. "Okay," I said. She sat down. She had the careful expression she used when she was preparing to explain something to me that she thought I'd misunderstood. "I know yesterday wasn't ideal," she said. "Wasn't ideal," I repeated. My sister was already stressed, and you know how things get when everyone is in one space. "I was asked to stay in my bedroom," I said, "in my house, on Easter. I didn't ask you to. You absolutely did." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you've never made an effort with them. You've always been difficult when they come around." I thought about every Christmas, every 4th of July, every Thanksgiving where I had sat at that table and passed dishes and asked her nephew about college and helped her brother-in-law jump his car in the driveway in 20-degree weather. Difficult. "I'm going to stay at Leonard's for a few days," I said. "I need to think." She looked startled. "That's a bit dramatic." "Maybe," I said. I put my plate in the sink. "But I'm going." Leonard had a spare room. It had been his son's room before his son moved to Phoenix, and it still had a cardinal's pennant on the wall and a twin bed with a mattress that was too soft, but I slept fine. Better than I expected. I called my son the second night. He lived in Nashville with his wife and their 2 kids. We talked for a long time. He listened the way he'd always listened, carefully, without jumping ahead. When I finished, he said, "Dad, I'm sorry, that wasn't right. He didn't tell me what to do. He just said that." It was enough. I was at Leonard's for 9 days. On the 8th day, I called my bank. I'm not sure exactly what made me do it that particular morning. I had been going through the mail Leonard had forwarded from the house. There are small indignities in the separation, even when it's only a trial one. And I noticed a credit card statement for an account I didn't recognize. The card was in my name. The address on the statement was a P.O. box I had never heard of. There were 7 charges over 3 months. An electronics store, a furniture place, a wire transfer to a name I didn't know. Total balance, just over $11,000. I sat at Leonard's kitchen table for a long time before I picked up the phone. The fraud department at my bank was thorough. They pulled the account history. They walked me through when it was opened 4 months earlier, which was before Easter, before any of this started, and how the account was linked to a secondary mailing address that had been added to my file. They flagged it as identity fraud. They asked if I knew anyone who might have had access to my personal documents. I said I needed to think about that. I hung up, and I sat very still. The account had been opened 4 months ago. 4 months ago, I had been home. My wallet lived in the same drawer it had lived in for 20 years. My Social Security card was in the filing cabinet in the study, in a folder labeled, in my handwriting, "Important Documents." My wife had known that folder existed since we moved into that house. I thought about the P.O. box. I thought about the name on the wire transfer. I thought about the name on the wire transfer. I thought about the timing. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Ms. Gallagher. She worked out of a small office on the east side of town, and a friend from the plan had used her for his divorce 7 years earlier and said she was sharp and fair. She was both. She listened to the whole thing. The Easter situation, the 9 days at Leonard's, the credit card, and she didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." The first thing she said was, "Don't go back to the house yet. Not until we knew more." The second thing she said was, "File the fraud report with the bank in writing that day." I had already started that process. She said, "Good." The third thing she said was to pull my credit report, all 3 bureaus, and to put a fraud alert on my file immediately. I did all of it that afternoon, sitting in her waiting room, then at the library 2 blocks away, using one of the public computers, printing everything out. There was another account, a personal loan, taken out 8 months earlier, $14,000, also in my name, also with the secondary mailing address, $25,000 total. I went back to Miss Gallagher's office, and I laid it all on her desk. She looked at the papers for a moment, then she looked at me. "Mr. Oakes," she said, "I should tell you my name since I've gotten this far without saying it. I'm Garrett Oakes, 63 years old, 34 years married, machinist for 31 years before I retired, and apparently for at least 8 months, the victim of financial fraud I had known nothing about. This is a serious matter. This is potentially federal." I nodded. "Do you want to know who opened these accounts before we proceed?" she said. "Or do you already know?" I already knew. I just needed someone else to say it out loud. The investigation took 3 weeks. I won't walk through all of it. The bank investigators, the notarized statements, the one conversation I had on the phone with my wife that went nowhere because she cried, and I couldn't keep my thoughts together when she cried, which was something she had always understood about me and apparently had decided to use. I'll just tell you what they found. The accounts had been opened using my social security number, my date of birth, a scan of my driver's license, which lived in my wallet, which lived in that drawer, and a secondary email address that had been created in my name. The P.O. box was registered in a neighboring county. The name on the wire transfer was my sister-in-law's husband, the man in the blazer, the man who couldn't forgive me for saying he'd had too much to drink. The furniture charges were for a piece my sister-in-law had mentioned wanting. I remembered because my wife had shown me a photo of it once and asked what I thought, and I'd said it looked expensive, and she'd said her sister really had good taste. Her sister's husband had received over $8,000 of the 25. The rest had gone to other charges I was still tracking. My wife said she hadn't known. She said it on the phone, and then she said it to Ms. Gallagher in a letter her own attorney sent, and then she said it to the investigator from the bank's fraud unit. She said it a great many times. I'm 63 years old. I have spent a lot of time around people. And I will tell you plainly, I didn't know what to believe. That was the hardest part. Not the money, though $25,000 is not nothing, not on a retired machinist's fixed income, but the not knowing, the sitting with the possibility that the woman I had shared a bed with for 34 years had either done this or had known about it and looked the other way while her family helped themselves to what was mine. Either way was something I couldn't come back from easily. My son drove up from Nashville when I told him the full story. He didn't tell me I had to leave her. He didn't tell me I had to stay. He sat at Leonard's kitchen table and he said, "Dad, whatever you decide, I'm with you." He said it like he meant it, and he's never been a person who says things he doesn't mean. My daughter-in-law sent me a care package, homemade cookies, and a card that said, "We love you, Grandpa," in crayon, which my grandson had apparently done himself. I'm not ashamed to tell you I sat with that card for a while. It helped. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. The bank recovered most of the funds over time through the fraud claims and what was ultimately a civil agreement with the parties involved. My brother-in-law did not go to federal prison, which Ms. Gallagher told me was unfortunately common in first-offense white-collar situations, but he faced significant civil liability, and I understand the blazer-wearing, bourbon-drinking days have been considerably curtailed. I did not file criminal charges against my wife. Ms. Gallagher advised me that the evidence of her direct involvement, while suspicious, would be difficult to prosecute. I made that decision myself in the end, after a long time thinking about it. What I did do was file for divorce, not in anger, not as a punishment. I had no interest in punishing anyone. I was 63 years old and I had a certain number of years left, and I wanted to spend them without asking myself every morning whether the person across the table from me had helped her family steal from me. My wife called me the night after she received the papers. She did not sound like someone reading off a grocery list. She sounded like someone who had understood, finally, that some things cannot be smoothed over, that some mornings you can come downstairs and find that the life you thought you had has already changed shape, quietly, without asking your permission. "Garrett," she said, "please." I was standing in Leonard's kitchen, looking out at his backyard. There was still a little light left in the sky, that thin gray April light that could go either way, stay or leave. "I know," I said, and I did. I knew she was scared. I knew she was scared. I knew she was sorry, in whatever way she was capable of being sorry. I knew that 34 years was not nothing. "This is a lot," she said. "Can't we just—" "I slept in my bedroom on Easter Sunday," I said, "while your family ate at my table." She didn't say anything. And while I was doing that, I said, someone was already using my name to borrow money. Still nothing. "I'm not angry," I said, and that was the truest thing I said in that whole conversation. I wasn't angry. I was something quieter and harder than anger. I was done. The divorce was finalized the following November. I'm not going to tell you it was simple, because it wasn't. 34 years of a life has to be untangled, and untangling is never clean. There were hard days. There were days I sat in that spare room with the Cardinals pennant and wondered if I'd made a mistake. There were days I called my son at 10 o'clock at night just to hear a familiar voice. But there were other days too. Leonard and I went fishing for a week up in Michigan in July. First time I'd done that in 15 years. I caught a wally that was embarrassingly large, and I have the photo to prove it. My grandson came to stay with me for 10 days in August, and we built a birdhouse in the garage and watched every Star Wars movie in order and ate cereal for dinner twice, because I said we could. He told his mother it was the best vacation he'd ever had. She told me, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something when she said it. I found an apartment. First floor, 2 bedrooms, a little porch out back where I can sit in the evenings. I bought a new chair. I planted tomatoes in 2 containers on the porch, same way my father used to. They came in better than I expected. Some mornings I wake up and the quiet feels like loss. I know that. 34 years doesn't just go away because you sign some papers. But some mornings, and this is the part I didn't expect, the quiet feels like something else entirely. It feels like the first day in a long time that nobody is asking me to make myself smaller. It feels like that thin April light, finally deciding to stay. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the fraud, not the paperwork, not the legal process. Those things are real, but they're not the heart of it. The heart of it is something simpler and harder to say out loud. What happened is that I let things go for too long. Not out of weakness, or not only weakness, out of the belief that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the marriage. I had told myself for years that tolerating her family's condescension was a form of love, that swallowing the small humiliations was what mature men did, that the scratched kitchen table and the 34 years and the life we had built together were worth more than whatever dignity I was setting down every holiday to make things run smoothly. I was wrong about that. Not about the value of patience. Patience matters, real patience, the kind that costs you something. But there's a version of patience that is actually just fear dressed up in reasonable clothes. Fear of conflict, fear of loss, fear of what happens when you finally say, "This is not acceptable." I had been practicing that second kind for a very long time, and I had called it love. And the people around me had accepted that arrangement without complaint, because it worked well for them. The morning I called the bank was the morning I stopped practicing that kind of patience. I want to be honest, I don't know exactly what my wife knew. I may never know, and I've made a certain peace with not knowing, because what I do know is that the conditions that allowed it to happen had existed in our home for years. When you allow people to treat you as optional, as someone who can be sent upstairs, whose presence at the table is an inconvenience, whose name can be borrowed, you are telling them, quietly, that your boundaries are not real, that there are no consequences waiting on the other side. Garrett Oakes sat in that bedroom on Easter Sunday. He let it happen. I'm not saying that to shame myself. I'm saying it because I think it's true, and because I think the truest lessons are usually the ones that point back at us first. What I learned, finally, at 63 is that dignity is not given to you. It is not something your spouse protects on your behalf or your family defends at the table. It is something you hold yourself every day in the small decisions, in whether you speak up or go quiet, in whether you name what's happening or decide it's not worth the trouble, in whether you pick up the phone and call the bank and the attorney the moment something doesn't look right. Leonard was good to me during those 9 days. He didn't give me advice I didn't ask for. He made chili and watched baseball and let me sit with my thoughts. That kind of friendship, the kind that simply stays present, is rarer than most people realize, and I was grateful for it. My son drove 4 hours without being asked twice. That told me everything I needed to know about how I had raised him, which was maybe the one thing I had gotten completely right. I planted tomatoes on my porch this spring. They're doing fine. Some mornings I sit out there with my coffee and I watch the light come up, and I feel something I don't have a perfect word for. It's not happiness exactly, it's something quieter, something that comes from knowing that the life I'm living now is the one I chose, on my own terms, with my eyes open. That's worth more than I can say, even at 63. Maybe especially at 63.